Ethan Carter had never expected to be the first one to see the fiery streak across the sky. It wasn't unusual to spot space debris on Yuri's IV, but this was something different. This was bigger. The red light illuminated the night as the object plunged toward the planet's surface, trailing a cloud of smoke. It moved erratically, suggesting it was out of control. Ethan had been working late in the outpost, fixing a malfunctioning generator. His eyes caught the unusual sight through the narrow window, and for a moment, he hesitated. It wasn't his job to investigate every strange event on the planet. However, a sudden urge to do something, to make a difference, made him grab his emergency gear and head out without a second thought. The outpost was located far from any major human settlements, and the landscape outside was barren, dotted with jagged rocks and patches of sparse alien vegetation. As Ethan stepped out into the chilly air, he pulled his jacket tighter, keeping his thoughts focused on the crash site. His boots crunched against the dry ground as he made his way to the coordinates where he had seen the streak. The crash site was about 2 miles from the outpost. Ethan arrived just as the last embers from the fiery descent were dimming. A cloud of dust hung in the air, and a small crater marked the spot where the object had landed. He approached carefully, his heart beating faster with each step. Then he saw it. The wreckage was a twisted mess of metal, and within it was something, or rather, someone, half buried beneath the debris. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a crash. There was something alive in the wreckage. Ethan rushed forward, his training kicking in as he moved to clear the debris. He lifted large metal panels, tossing them aside with surprising ease. As he cleared the last piece, he found her, a young alien girl, her body covered in strange glowing patterns. She was unconscious, her skin faintly shimmering in the dim light, but she was still breathing. Her features were unlike anything Ethan had seen before. Her skin was a soft shade of pale blue, with glowing markings running across her arms and neck. Her long, dark hair was tangled, and her face was bruised, though not fatally. Her clothes were torn, and her breathing was shallow. Ethan didn't hesitate. He checked for a pulse. It was weak but steady. Without wasting another moment, he pulled out his medical kit and began administering first aid. He'd never treated an alien before, but he had enough knowledge to stabilize a human, and he hoped that would be enough. He carefully placed a breathing mask over her face, adjusting the settings to match her apparent physiology. As he worked, he noticed how delicate her features were. She didn't look threatening, despite being from a species he'd never encountered. The Aelari, he thought to himself. He had heard rumors of their existence, but they were considered a myth, a story told by explorers in the distant corners of the galaxy. "Come on, stay with me," he murmured as he finished bandaging her wounds. It wasn't long before she stirred, her eyelids fluttering. She gasped for air, her eyes darting around in confusion. Her voice came out as a soft whisper in a language Ethan didn't understand. Her words were a blend of tones that seemed melodic, almost otherworldly. Ethan stepped back slowly, giving her space. "Hey, easy," he said, speaking in calm, measured tones. He had no idea if she could understand him, but he hoped his voice would comfort her in some way. She raised her hand weakly, touching the side of her head, as if trying to process what had just happened. Then her eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The alien girl's gaze was intense, filled with both fear and curiosity. Ethan felt an odd sense of connection in that brief moment, though he had no idea why. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, not sure if she could understand the words. Her lips moved, but she didn't speak. Instead, her glowing markings seemed to pulse softly, almost as if they were reacting to his presence. It was strange, like the patterns on her skin were alive in some way. Ethan took a step forward, holding out his hand. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, trying to convey the sincerity of his words through his actions. "I just want to help." To his surprise, she slowly reached out, placing her hand in his. Her skin was cool, but there was a softness to it that made Ethan's heart race. The touch felt intimate, even though it was their first interaction. She didn't say anything, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was scared, yes, but there was something else, a flicker of trust. She needed help, and Ethan was determined to give it. With her hand still in his, Ethan carefully helped her to her feet, making sure she didn't stumble. Her legs were shaky, and she seemed exhausted, but she didn't resist. For the first time since their meeting, he saw a faint smile on her lips, small but genuine. It was a moment of connection, a moment that would change everything. Ethan knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something that could redefine everything he thought he knew about life beyond Earth. Over the next few days, Ethan did everything he could to help Kayla recover. She had told him her name in a soft, melodic voice that had taken him a while to understand. But after some time, he had learned the basics of communicating with her. It was a slow process, but they managed to exchange a few words and gestures, enough to begin building a fragile bridge of trust. Ethan knew Kayla was still in pain, though her injuries had been treated. Her body healed at a slower rate than a human's, but there was something mesmerizing about the way her glowing markings seemed to pulse, reacting to her environment. The soft glow had a calming effect on Ethan, as though she was telling him that everything would be okay. As the days passed, Kayla seemed to relax around him, even if she was still cautious. She watched him with wide, curious eyes, her gaze following every movement he made. Ethan wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he could tell she was trying to understand him, just as he was trying to understand her. It was a strange kind of silent companionship, but it was comforting to both of them. Ethan's days were filled with simple tasks: gathering food, fixing small pieces of equipment around the outpost, and making sure Kayla had everything she needed. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore: the look in her eyes whenever she looked at him. It was a mix of gratitude and curiosity, but also something deeper. It was clear that she wasn't used to being helped, especially by a human. As he spent more time with her, Ethan began to wonder if Kayla had ever encountered humans before. Her people were distant, and the few rumors he had heard said the Elari kept to themselves, isolated from the galaxy's other species. One evening, after a long day of repairs, Ethan sat outside the small shelter where they had been staying. The sky was a brilliant shade of purple, dotted with stars that seemed far too close. He had grown used to the quiet, the peace of being alone with Kayla. But there was a restlessness inside him. The idea of being the only human to encounter an Elari felt surreal. Kayla appeared beside him, her glowing markings lighting up the dark as she stepped into view. She didn't say anything, but she sat down next to him, her presence both comforting and mysterious. Ethan glanced at her, trying to figure out what she was thinking. She was so different from him. Her eyes were a bright, glowing blue, full of wisdom and depth. Her skin shimmered like the night sky, and every movement she made seemed graceful, almost ethereal. "Do you miss your home?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but full of curiosity. Kayla turned her head to look at him, her expression unreadable. She shook her head slowly, her eyes lingering on his face. Then she pointed to the sky, her fingers tracing an imaginary line between the stars. Ethan understood. She was telling him that her home was far away, beyond the stars he could see. She didn't miss it because she had been separated from it long ago. Or maybe she had accepted that she would never return. The sadness in her eyes was evident, even if she didn't voice it. Ethan nodded, his thoughts drifting. "I can't imagine what that must feel like," he said, his voice soft. He didn't know what it was like to lose everything and be stranded on a strange world. He could only imagine how lonely Kayla must have felt before he found her. A breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of the planet's alien flora. Kayla seemed to inhale deeply, her eyes closing for a moment as though taking in the world around her. She opened her eyes again and met Ethan's gaze. This time, there was something different in her look, a deeper trust. "You're safe here," Ethan said, his voice steady and calm. "I promise. I won't let anything happen to you. Kayla's lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak, but she stopped herself. Instead, she placed a hand on her chest, then gently touched her fingers to Ethan's arm. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make Ethan's heart race. It was her way of saying thank you, he realized. A simple, unspoken bond that told him everything he needed to know. The days that followed were filled with more quiet moments like this one. Kayla became more comfortable with Ethan, even allowing him to touch her arm lightly when he helped her move or when he handed her food. Each time, her gaze softened and Ethan felt a little closer to her, though he didn't know if it was possible to truly understand her. One afternoon, Ethan noticed Kayla was more restless than usual. She wandered outside, her eyes scanning the horizon, as though waiting for something. When she turned back to look at him, her expression was serious. It was as if she was trying to tell him something, but she couldn't find the words. Ethan stood up and walked toward her, sensing her unease. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Kayla's eyes met his, and she shook her head. She pointed toward the distant mountains, where a dark shape was moving across the sky. Another ship, he realized. She looked at him, her gaze filled with fear and mourning. "Who are they?" Ethan asked, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen any other ships in the area before. Could they be looking for Kayla? Kayla's expression was grim, but she didn't speak. She simply stepped closer to him, her hand brushing his arm in a silent plea for protection. Ethan understood then. The calm they had shared was over. Something, or someone, was coming for them. The shadow of the ship loomed over the horizon, its sleek, alien shape cutting through the dark sky. Ethan's heart raced as he looked at Kayla, who stood beside him, her eyes wide with fear. She had been calm, even trusting, for the past few days, but now she was on edge, every muscle in her body tense. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kayla didn't answer directly. Instead, she took a step back and glanced around, as though trying to figure out where they could go. Her glowing markings flickered, reflecting her anxiety. Ethan noticed how her skin seemed to pulse, almost as if reacting to her emotions. "They're after you, aren't they?" Ethan said, piecing it together. The ship's appearance wasn't a coincidence. It must have been searching for her. Kayla's presence was no longer a secret. Kayla nodded slowly, a look of worry crossing her face. She touched her chest and then pointed to the ship, her expression grave. Ethan didn't need her to explain further. He understood. These weren't friendly visitors. "We need to hide," Ethan said urgently, already scanning the landscape for a place to take shelter. There was no time to lose. They had to move quickly before whoever was in that ship landed and found them. Kayla hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the ship in the distance, but when she saw Ethan's determined expression, she finally nodded and motioned for him to follow her. Ethan kept close behind her as she led him through the rocky terrain. Her movements were swift and sure, despite her still healing injuries. The soft glow of her skin illuminated the path ahead, but Ethan had learned to stay alert. Every sound, every shadow, seemed more dangerous now. The ship hovered in the distance, growing closer with each passing moment. Ethan's thoughts raced. He wasn't equipped to fight an entire alien crew. He was just an engineer on a mining outpost, and the tools at his disposal weren't made for defense. But he wasn't going to let Kayla down. Not after everything she had trusted him with. They reached a narrow cave hidden between two large boulders. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it was better than being out in the open. Kayla entered first, her glowing markings casting eerie light against the walls. Ethan followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out at the sky one last time, making sure the ship hadn't spotted them yet. Inside the cave, Kayla sat down against the wall, her breathing a little faster now. She was exhausted, both from the physical toll of the journey and the fear of being hunted. Ethan could see the strain in her eyes, and it made his resolve even stronger. "I won't let them take you," he promised, kneeling beside her. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, as though she knew how difficult this would be. Her people, the Aelari, didn't mix with humans. They didn't trust outsiders, and they certainly didn't rely on them. But somehow, she had placed her trust in him. Ethan took a deep breath. "We're not giving up," he said. "We'll find a way to survive this. Together." Kayla placed a hand on his arm. Her touch gentle but firm. There was something about the way she looked at him now. Something different. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, an unspoken connection that transcended words. The sound of a distant engine echoed through the cave. The ship was getting closer. Ethan looked around the small space for anything he could use. There was nothing much, just the bare rock, a few scattered leaves, and some scraps of old tech that had been left behind by previous explorers. He turned to Kayla. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency. Kayla nodded, standing up with surprising strength. She moved to one side of the cave and began to rummage through the abandoned items. As she worked, Ethan took out his tools and began to fiddle with his communication device. He didn't know if it would work, but he needed to try. If he could somehow block the signal or jam the tracking system, maybe they could buy themselves enough time to escape. Kayla approached him, holding a piece of alien technology in her hands. It looked like a small, compact device, something that could emit a signal. She handed it to him with a quiet look, as if asking him to use it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What does this do?" he asked, turning the device over in his hands. Kayla's glowing markings flickered brighter for a moment as she pointed to the device. She touched her chest and then gestured to the sky, her expression serious. Ethan understood. This device could disrupt the signal and maybe even scramble the ship's tracking system. "Good thinking," Ethan said with a smile, feeling a surge of hope. Maybe they had a chance after all. Together, they worked quickly. Ethan connected the device to his communication gear, while Kayla monitored the outside world, watching the sky through the narrow opening of the cave. Time was running out. The ship was now only minutes away. With one last check, Ethan powered up the makeshift jammer. The device emitted a low hum, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if it was working. Kayla's expression didn't change, but she seemed focused. She nodded toward the sky, signaling that the ship was almost directly above them. Ethan held his breath, hoping against hope that their plan would work. If not, he wasn't sure what they would do next. The ship's landing was imminent. Would it be enough to fool them? The low hum of the jammer filled the cave, vibrating the air around Ethan as he watched Kayla's focused expression. Outside, the sound of the alien ship grew louder, its engines descending with power and purpose. Ethan's heart raced. Would their makeshift defense work? The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, each second a test of their fragile plan. Kayla stood by the entrance, her eyes fixed on the sky, her glowing skin dimming slightly in the darkness of the cave. She was still calm, but Ethan could see the tension in her posture. She had spent most of her life avoiding detection, but now, for the first time, someone was helping her fight back. That someone was human, and Ethan wasn't sure if it made her feel safer or more vulnerable. "Is it working?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the panic from creeping into his voice. The ship was now hovering directly above them, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest. Kayla didn't answer immediately. She raised her hand and pointed to the sky, motioning for him to wait. Her eyes narrowed as she concentrated, her body language telling him everything he needed to know. The ship hadn't yet detected the interference. They were safe for the moment, but how long could they stay hidden? The ship loomed overhead, its lights scanning the ground below. Ethan crouched low, his breath shallow, willing the jammer to hold. He had no idea how long it could block the signal, but if they were lucky, it would be enough to give them a head start. Suddenly, the ship's engines began to grow louder again, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. Had the jammer failed? But then, to his surprise, The ship slowly began to move away, its searchlight fading into the distance. Keela exhaled deeply, and Ethan allowed himself to breathe again. The immediate danger had passed, but the sense of relief was short-lived. They still weren't safe. The ship could return at any moment, and the entire pursuit had just begun. Keela turned back toward him, her eyes glowing softly in the dim light of the cave. "We have to move," she said, her voice calm but urgent. She didn't need to explain. Ethan understood. They couldn't stay here any longer. Ethan nodded. "Where do we go?" he asked, already packing his gear into a small bag. The cave had been a temporary refuge, but it wasn't a safe haven. It was only a matter of time before the ship returned, and they needed a new place to hide. Keela led the way again, her steps light but deliberate. Ethan followed closely behind, staying on high alert. The rocky landscape outside the caves stretched out before them, wild and desolate. There was no obvious shelter, only hills and strange rock formations. The alien sky above was dotted with two moons, casting long shadows over the ground. They walked for hours, covering as much ground as they could before the ship's engines could be heard again. The sky began to change colors as the second moon rose higher, bathing the planet in a silvery glow. The wind picked up, blowing cold air through the rocky terrain. It felt like a storm was brewing, and as the winds howled around them, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. Finally, Keela stopped at the base of a large rock formation, a group of towering stones that seemed to form a natural barrier. Ethan noticed that the rocks were different from the ones they had passed earlier, smooth, almost like they had been shaped by an intelligent hand. Keela seemed to recognize the place. She turned to Ethan, her expression serious. "This way," she said softly, motioning to the narrow opening between the stones. Ethan followed her inside, feeling the coolness of the stone walls as they moved deeper into the shelter. The cave was much larger than he had expected, stretching out in a network of narrow corridors. It felt ancient, untouched by time. As they moved deeper, Ethan felt a sense of awe. The place seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost like it was alive. The walls were covered in glowing symbols, some of which looked similar to the markings on Keela's skin. There were no signs of life here, no sounds other than their footsteps echoing in the silence. It was as if they had stumbled upon a forgotten sanctuary. Keela paused for a moment, her hand resting against the wall. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as though she was drawing strength from the very rocks around them. Ethan watched her in silence, sensing the weight of her emotions. She had led him here, to a place that felt like home, but it also felt like a last resort. "What is this place?" Ethan asked quietly. Keela turned to him, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and hope. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though choosing her words carefully. "A sanctuary," she finally said. "It is a place for my people to hide, a place of safety when the outside world is too dangerous." Ethan's heart sank. It made sense now. This wasn't just a random cave. It was a place of refuge, hidden away from the eyes of those who might seek to harm her people. But it was also a place of loss. Keela had already told him her people were few, scattered, and hunted. Ethan stepped closer to her, his voice soft. "We'll be safe here," he promised, even though he wasn't sure if that was true. "We'll stay as long as we need to." Keela's glowing eyes softened. She gave him a small, tired smile, her hand brushing against his arm once more in a silent gesture of thanks. For the first time since they had met, Ethan felt a quiet sense of peace. They weren't alone. They had each other. But even in this hidden sanctuary, Ethan knew they weren't truly safe. The storm was far from over, and the pursuit would continue. But for now, they had a brief moment of respite, a fleeting chance to rest before the next challenge. Days passed as Ethan and Keela stayed hidden in the sanctuary. The alien world around them was harsh and unforgiving, but the cave offered a brief sense of security. As time went on, the two grew closer, their bond deepening in silence and shared hardship. Kayla no longer looked at Ethan with suspicion or fear. There was a quiet understanding between them, a silent promise of protection and companionship. The mornings were cold, and the winds howled outside, but inside the cave, the temperature remained comfortable, as though the walls themselves were shielding them from the planet's relentless conditions. Kayla would spend hours studying the glowing symbols on the walls, tracing the intricate lines with her fingers. Ethan watched her in quiet curiosity. He had no idea what the markings meant, but he could tell that Kayla found comfort in them. It was as though they held memories, secrets from her past, that she wasn't ready to share. One morning, Ethan woke to find Kayla standing at the entrance of their hidden sanctuary, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The ship that had been chasing them had not returned, but Ethan knew they couldn't let their guard down. He stood and walked over to her, his footsteps soft on the rocky floor. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Kayla turned to him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't place. She smiled faintly, her glowing markings dimming slightly in the light. She nodded, but it was clear that something was bothering her. There was a heaviness in her expression, a quiet sadness that lingered in her gaze. "I'm fine," she said softly, but her voice betrayed her. Ethan could tell she was hiding something. He hesitated before speaking. "You don't have to pretend. I can tell something's wrong." Kayla looked away for a moment, her fingers brushing against the wall as she seemed lost in thought. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice low. "I'm not the only one here," she said, her words barely above a whisper. Ethan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Kayla took a deep breath and turned to face him fully. Her glowing eyes met his, and for the first time, she seemed vulnerable, as though she were on the verge of revealing something important. "There are others like me," she explained. "Other Aelari. We were scattered, divided after something terrible happened." Ethan's curiosity deepened, but he didn't interrupt. He could see that this was difficult for her to say. "There was a war," Kayla continued, her voice trembling slightly. "My people were attacked, hunted down by a force we couldn't escape. We tried to hide, but they found us. Many of us were captured, and many more died in the struggle. Only a few of us remain, and now they're coming for the last of us." Ethan's heart tightened as he listened. He could sense the weight of Kayla's words, the pain in her voice. The peaceful, glowing woman he had come to care for was not just a victim of circumstance. She was a survivor of something far darker, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "Who are they? The ones hunting you?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. Kayla closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep, steadying breath before she answered. "I don't know their names. They are a group of mercenaries, a ruthless faction hired by the enemies of my people. They've been hunting us for years, tracking down the last survivors. And now, they know I'm here." The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. The danger Kayla was in was far greater than he had ever realized. She wasn't just running from a single ship or a random group of attackers. She was running from a powerful, organized enemy determined to wipe out her entire species. Ethan's mind raced. "We can't stay here then." "They'll find us," he said urgently. Kayla shook her head slowly. "No, they can't. Not here. This sanctuary was built by my ancestors to hide us from them. They won't be able to track us here, at least not easily." Ethan wasn't sure how much he believed her, but something in her eyes made him want to trust her. Kayla had survived everything thrown her way so far. If she said they were safe here for now, maybe they were. "But what happens if they do find us?" Ethan asked, his worry growing. "How long can we hide? We don't know how many of them there are." Kayla's eyes softened. "I don't know. But I will protect you, Ethan. You helped me when no one else would. Now I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe." She placed a hand on his arm, the gesture gentle but firm. Ethan nodded, feeling the deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. He had come to care for Kayla more than he had expected. He wasn't just helping her because she needed it. He was helping her because he wanted to. He wanted to protect her, to keep her safe, just as she was doing for him. "You've already protected me," he said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Kayla smiled faintly, her glowing markings flickering in the soft light of the cave. It was the first time in days that her expression seemed lighter, less burdened. For a brief moment, the weight of their situation seemed to lift, and Ethan allowed himself to feel hope. But even as they shared this quiet moment of peace, the reality of their situation was never far from their minds. They were in a race against time. The enemies Kayla had spoken of were still out there, and they would not stop until they found her. The storm was far from over, and the world outside was still filled with dangers they could not escape. For now, though, they had each other, and that was enough. The days in the hidden sanctuary had begun to feel like a fleeting moment of peace. The world outside, with its dangers and threats, seemed far away, as though time itself had slowed within the walls of the cave. But even in this silence, Ethan could feel the tension, like the calm before a storm. Kayla had told him about the mercenaries hunting her people, but hearing about them was far different from knowing they were coming for them. It had been nearly a week since the attack, and the ship hadn't returned. Yet every day they moved quietly, constantly aware of their surroundings. Kayla's eyes were sharp, always scanning the skies and the land. Ethan had learned to trust her instincts. When she moved, he followed without question. But on this morning, something was different. Ethan awoke early as the soft light from the twin moons began to filter into the cave. Kayla was standing at the entrance again, her eyes narrowing as she looked out into the distance. Her glowing markings pulsed softly, a sign that she was alert and sensing something. "Kayla," Ethan called quietly, stepping closer. His voice was low, careful not to startle her. She turned to him slowly, her face tight with worry. "They're here," she said simply, her voice steady, but there was an edge of urgency in her tone. "They found us." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know?" "I can feel them," Kayla replied, her eyes scanning the horizon once more. "Their ship is close, but they've been hiding in the clouds. They know we're here. It's only a matter of time before they move in." Ethan's mind raced. The ship. The mercenaries. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it hit him harder than expected. "Do we need to leave?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the rush of adrenaline surging through him. Kayla nodded slowly. "We can't stay here anymore. It's too dangerous. The sanctuary is safe, but they have ways of finding us." She paused and turned to him, her gaze intense. "We have to fight. We have to do whatever it takes to stop them." Ethan felt a surge of determination. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't trained for battle. He was just a man who had been thrust into a conflict he didn't understand. But the thought of Kayla being hunted, of losing her after everything they had been through, stirred something deep within him. He wasn't going to let that happen. "What can I do?" Ethan asked, his voice low but firm. "I'll do whatever I can to help." Kayla gave him a look that was both sad and resolute. "There is little you can do with what we have," she said, walking toward a pile of discarded tools and alien technology in the corner. She sifted through them quickly, selecting a small cylindrical device. "But we'll need this. It's a communications jammer. If we can place it on their ship, we can prevent them from calling reinforcements." Ethan took the device from her hands. It felt light, but he could sense its power. It was the kind of technology that seemed far beyond anything humans could produce. Still, he wasn't afraid of it. He had learned to trust Kayla, and if she said it could help, he believed her. "Where do we place it?" he asked, eager to act. Kayla hesitated for a moment before responding. "We have to get close. The ship is hovering just above the surface. If we can get to the side, where the communications array is, we can attach the jammer directly to it." Ethan frowned. Getting close to a hostile ship wasn't exactly the plan he had in mind. But if it meant saving Kayla, he was willing to take the risk. "Okay," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Let's do it." Kayla led the way, her movements graceful but quick. They climbed out of the sanctuary and moved deeper into the rocky landscape. The terrain was difficult, with jagged cliffs and sparse vegetation, but Kayla seemed to know exactly where she was going. They had to be careful. If the mercenaries were close, they wouldn't get a second chance. As they approached a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below, Ethan could see the ship hovering in the distance. It was large and dark, blending into the cloudy sky. There were no visible markings, but its shape was unmistakable. The sleek, angular design spoke of advanced technology, of something built for one purpose: to track, hunt, and destroy. "Do you think they've spotted us yet?" Ethan asked in a low voice, watching the ship closely. "No," Kayla answered, her voice steady but filled with tension. "They haven't, but they're getting closer. We need to move faster." They descended the ridge and moved closer to the ship. The ground was uneven, making it difficult to stay quiet. Every step felt like it could give them away. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they crept closer to the vessel. The ship was enormous, its engine's hums barely audible against the roar of the wind. "Get ready," Kayla whispered, pointing to a small hatch on the side of the ship. "That's our way in." Ethan's throat went dry. The hatch was guarded by two mercenaries, standing motionless with their weapons at the ready. He swallowed hard, looking at Kayla. "We'll have to take them out quietly," Kayla said, her voice calm but resolute. "You'll need to stay close." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He had never been in a fight before, but he wasn't going to let Kayla down. He couldn't. They moved into position, the world around them narrowing as they focused on the task ahead. This was no longer about survival. It was about making sure they both lived to see the next day. The world seemed to hold its breath as Ethan and Kayla crouched in the shadow of the enemy ship. The two mercenaries guarding the hatch were close, their weapons glinting in the weak light filtering through the clouds above. Kayla's eyes flickered toward them, her expression calm, but there was a fierce determination in her gaze. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was fighting for her people, for her future, and for the life she'd begun to share with Ethan. "Stay low," Kayla whispered, her voice a mere breath against the howling wind. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. The air felt charged with tension. He could hear the distant hum of the ship's engines, and the mercenaries' voices, low and unintelligible. They moved as one, their steps silent on the rocky ground, barely disturbing the sand beneath their feet. Kayla reached out, gently touching Ethan's arm to signal him to stop. They were just a few steps away from the guards now. Kayla gestured to the left, where a narrow path led to a cluster of large rocks. They would have to get closer to the guards to get to the hatch. Ethan swallowed, his stomach tight with nerves, but there was no turning back now. He trusted Kayla, and she was leading them toward survival. They slid behind the rocks, waiting for the right moment. The wind picked up, whistling through the canyon, masking their movements. The mercenaries seemed distracted by the ship's systems, their backs turned slightly. It was the chance they needed. "Now," Kayla murmured, and without another word, they dashed forward, closing the distance in a few quick strides. Kayla moved first, swift and silent, her body gliding through the shadows. Ethan followed, trying to keep his movements as smooth and silent as hers. Kayla was by the first mercenary in an instant. She moved behind him, her hand quick and steady as she used the element of surprise to disarm him. A soft gasp escaped the mercenary's lips as Kayla pressed a blade to his throat, her other hand securing his wrist. Ethan froze for a moment, watching her with awe. Kayla was faster than he had expected, and despite her alien nature, there was something about her that seemed entirely human in her determination. The second mercenary turned just as Ethan stepped forward, his mind racing for the next move. The second guard raised his weapon, but before he could react, Ethan lunged forward, grabbing the mercenary's arm and pulling it downward. His heart raced, his palms sweating, but the training he had received as a soldier kicked in. He twisted the guard's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon. The mercenary staggered, trying to recover, but Ethan was already on top of him. A few quick strikes, and the mercenary was subdued, his body crumpling to the ground. Ethan stepped back, breathing heavily, his body shaking with adrenaline. Kayla lowered her blade, her eyes glowing softly in the dim light. She nodded at him, her expression calm. "Good work." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I didn't think I had it in me." "You do," Kayla replied, her voice steady. "We all have strength we don't always see until we need it." Together, they turned to the hatch. The path was clear. They had taken the first step in their fight, but there was still more to be done. Kayla approached the hatch and quickly examined the control panel beside it. Her fingers moved with precision, and within moments, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the ship's corridors were sterile and cold, bathed in a harsh blue light. Kayla led the way, her movements swift and sure as she navigated the ship's interior. Ethan followed closely behind, feeling the weight of their mission. They were close now. They reached the communications array without incident, a large, humming structure at the heart of the ship. The jammer Kayla had brought was small but powerful. Ethan handed it to her, watching as she attached it carefully to the array's central unit. "There," Kayla said, stepping back. "It's activated." Ethan held his breath, waiting for the inevitable. They had only moments before the enemy realized what had happened. A loud beep echoed throughout the ship, followed by the flashing of red lights. They had been discovered. "We need to go now," Kayla urged, her eyes scanning the ship's control panels. The alarms blared, signaling that their presence had been detected. Ethan nodded, panic rising in his chest. "Which way?" "Follow me," Kayla replied, her voice firm as she led him through a maze of hallways. The ship began to shake slightly as it powered up, its engines preparing for a fast escape. The mercenaries would be coming for them soon. As they ran, Ethan could hear the sounds of footsteps behind them, getting louder with each passing second. The ship was alive with movement, the sounds of the mercenaries preparing to hunt them down. But Ethan and Kayla didn't stop. They pushed forward, determined to escape, to survive. Finally, they reached the airlock. The door slid open, and they stepped into the cold, harsh atmosphere outside. The wind whipped around them, but there was no time to think about the elements. They had to move quickly. Kayla grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward a nearby transport shuttle. "In," she commanded. Without hesitation, Ethan followed her into the shuttle. The doors slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside. Kayla's hands flew over the controls, her expression focused. The shuttle hummed to life, lifting off the ground and speeding away from the enemy ship. As they soared into the sky, away from the danger, Ethan glanced at Kayla. She was still tense, her eyes scanning the sky for any signs of pursuit. But for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope in her expression. They had survived the first strike, but the war was far from over.